Please welcome the president and founder of the Development Alternatives Group, Dr. Ashok Khosla, who joins us via satellite from Beijing. Dr. Khosla, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
It's nice to meet you, sir. Now, you founded the leading environment organization in India called the Development Alternatives Group. What was the idea there?
Basically, to eradicate poverty and to bring back the health of the natural environment.
All right. So as a direct of, and really even an indirect result of your group's efforts in rural villages, millions of jobs have been created. So I think everyone around the world wants to know how, with projects in villages and small communities, can you create millions of jobs?
Well, actually, Michael, the only way to create large numbers of jobs is in small doses, because big companies, big factories, and big projects don't actually create jobs. They create lots and lots of machinery, but not many jobs. What you need to do is to actually get into the community and create local jobs. And all over the world, in the US, in Germany, in India, it's the small enterprises that actually create jobs, and that's what we do.
Well, I think you're making a great point, because a lot of us think of big projects and making big jobs, but sometimes those jobs are over when the project is done. By going into the community, you're actually creating jobs that will last for a while for these communities, and you're getting them involved in their own towns. Let's talk about, we'll step back just a second.
In fact, the only...
No, go ahead, sir. I'm sorry. We've just got that satellite delay, so go ahead.
I was just saying that the only way really to eradicate unemployment in the world is, in fact, to put everybody in charge of their lives. And, you know, entrepreneurship is the way to create livelihoods. And livelihoods are the need of the hour right now.
I think it's what people want to hear, because it feels like we can take the power back in our community. So let's step back just a second, because your relationship with these issues started when you were truly rather young, as we would say in America, just a kid. So what hardships did you face growing up that kind of made you interested in social change?
I didn't really experience many hardships as such. I was a refugee. My country broke up into two in 1947, and I was a young kid, and we were refugees, walking for many days together in order to get away from the dangers. And we landed up in a place of safety. What happens when you've been through an experience like that is that you see a lot of misery, a lot of deprivation, a lot of hardship on the way. And that makes you wonder why it should be like that. Right. So I'm not sure that I would say I was concerned by social issues. I was just concerned about why humanity is in the kind of shape it is. And that was an experience that led to other things. But I was a privileged refugee. My parents became diplomats. I got a terrific education overseas. And when I came back to India, I realized that my job was, in fact, not to allow this kind of thing to happen to anyone else.
Well, that interest in social concerns kind of merged with environmental interests at some point, and that's when you met Vice President Al Gore. Tell me a little bit about that meeting.
Well, I was teaching a course at Harvard with Professor Roger Revelle, the man who actually discovered climate change. And Vice President Al Gore talks about him quite a lot in his films and his talks. And Roger was a true giant of science. He was an amazing person. I worked with him for about 30 years after that. And we concocted this first course, probably in the world, called People, Resources, and the Environment. And that got me thinking about how the relationship between the human condition, particularly the condition of the poor, relates to environmental degradation. In fact, poverty is the lack of resources, and I realized very early in the game that you couldn't really separate the two. Poverty causes degradation of the environment, and degradation of the environment causes more poverty. It's a trap, and one has to get out of that vicious cycle by breaking it, by creating what I call sustainable livelihoods.
So with Professor Roger Revelle, you published a book called The Survival Equation. It was basically some of the Harvard class readings.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that book, how people responded to it, and do you think it would still hold up currently today?
Yes, actually, it's very timely even today. It was very early in the game. We're talking about 1967, 68 when it was published, when the word environment was hardly known by anyone.
Yeah.
So we were really looking at issues that went to the core of the problem. At that time, the big environmental issues were DDT in penguins, acid rain, issues relating to some wildlife and species loss, but by and large it was a fairly narrow field. What this book tried to do was to show that it actually is the model of development, the model of our economy that is causing the problems. And the unintended consequences of many of the things we value, like industrialization and better access to goods and services, actually have impacts that often negate the value of those goods and services. So we were trying to show in this book that people and resources and environment are all intimately interlinked, and by doing so we were trying to attract the attention of policymakers, because these young people would one day become policymakers, into thinking more broadly about the issues that they deal with.
And look how forward-thinking you were at that time to where we sit today. Now, I love the conversation that you make and the connection you make between poverty and the environment. You say it's not enough to improve the environment. We need to eliminate poverty as well. Let's go back to that statement and talk about why you think these things are so interconnected.
Well, first of all, poverty is in itself a cause of environment. It's not a common saying that the poor cause any damage, but in fact, out of the exigency of survival, they have to get water and twigs for their fires. They have to essentially subsist off the environment, and that usually leads to overutilization of what we call renewable resources and makes them non-renewable. Poverty, on the other hand, is also the victim. The poor are victims of the wealth and the overutilization of resources by the rich. We call these two diseases, they're sort of terminal diseases. One is called affluenza, which is the overutilization, overconsumption of resources, and the other is called povertitis, where it's actually to do with underutilization of resources. Now, the fundamental relationship between those is in fact in population growth. The poor basically have very few choices other than to have large families in order to survive. And what we were trying to show way back in the mid-60s, that the easiest way to save the environment is to reduce population growth by making the lives of people better so they would have smaller families. And the fewer the number of people on this planet, the less pressure there is on its resources.
Makes perfect sense even today. So we're talking about India this hour. Let's use you to do that further. Let's talk about the direct climate impacts in India. What are they, and what are some of the answers?
Well, so far the direct climate impacts have been more in the way of extreme events, of storms, of hurricanes, of basically of a change in the weather patterns, particularly of the monsoons, which the whole country and the whole of that region depends very, very solidly on. Now, if these rains, for example, change, the droughts come, obviously they have a huge impact. The bigger impacts are, for example, the melting of glaciers in the north, in the Himalayas, which were really not only the source of the waters of the plains, but the mitigating, the modifying factor, the ones that actually controlled the flow so that you wouldn't have floods and you wouldn't have drought. So essentially, those are the kinds of impacts that we have already begun to see. Now, obviously, as the sea level rises and a lot of other things happen, there will be bigger and bigger impacts in the future. Basically, it's a finite land mass, a finite land area in the subcontinent of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And if people get displaced, they're going to have to go somewhere, and that's going to have a huge densification problem of people moving into not just cities, but into confined areas, which is going to cause a lot of problems.
Now, we just heard Vice President Gore talk about the perfect conditions for solar, and India, in fact, is doing a lot already. Let's talk about what they're doing right now and what you're most excited about in the future.
Well, maybe I can tell you, you've been hearing about a lot of things on solar, and I think it's extremely important that we switch to renewables of all kinds, not just solar, but wind and micro hydro and a variety of biomass-based energy sources. We've got a lot of things to do beyond solar, but we do, in my own organization, do a lot of work with solar, and we've been setting up mini grids, micro and mini grids in small villages where we basically distribute solar energy at a price people can afford, and make it possible for people to get at least a light and some cell phone charging facility, maybe a fan to improve their lives. And this has been quite revolutionary in the lives of people.
It seems like an amazing improvement, even though it seems like such a simple improvement. Dr. Khosla, thank you so much for spending your time and being with us tonight, because I think it's been truly enlightening about what's going on in India for those of us who aren't there every day. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.